This is John Adams' Nixon in China. Hello, I'm Justin Birchall. I'm a vocalist, specifically a baritone. And today I'd like to talk to you about this opera, its genesis, the story behind it, why I consider it to be a seminally important work, and then I'd like to perform for you an excerpt from Richard Nixon's Act 1 aria, News Has a Kind of Mystery, and talk about the importance of that aria within the baritone repertoire and within contemporary opera in general. The composer of Nixon in China is John Coolidge Adams, not to be confused with the other major American composer and his fellow Pulitzer Prize winner John Luther Adams. John Adams was born in 1947, is a native New Englander, and received his musical education at Harvard University. He first came to national prominence with the piece considered his breakthrough piece, Shaker Loops of 1978. Here is a little bit of Shaker Loops. This excerpt demonstrates many characteristics that are fundamental to John Adams' musical language or musical orientation, we could say, including a very strong pulse-driven element to the rhythmic conception, which is very much drawn from the minimalism of Reich, Glass, and Riley, as well as an interest in long-held harmonies or harmonic stasis, and simple harmonies that may indeed be called tonal. Now, as his career progresses along, John Adams' language, particularly his harmonic language, will grow more and more complex, and he'll find himself interested in harmonic language that may be drawn more from Strauss, Schoenberg, Berg, but he still hews to his roots, and often versions of tonality still come back up present throughout his work. To just give a little example of his evolution towards a more, let's say, a more dissonant harmonic style, listen to this excerpt from his opera Dr. Atomic. So that piece is from 2005, so that's 27 years later than Shaker Loops, which we heard before. So that gives a good demonstration of how much Adams' harmonic practice progressed in those 27 years. So the plot of the opera Nixon in China is based on a real historical event. The Nixon of the title is, of course, U.S. President Richard Nixon. In 1972, Nixon traveled to the People's Republic of China and held a summit with the leaders of Communist China, which would be Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai. The PRC had been behind a sort of iron curtain. So Nixon's trip to mainland China in 1972 was a major shift in U.S. attitudes, therefore a very, very major historical event. So now I'd like to talk about what I believe makes Nixon in China so special and so important, why I consider it a major work of the vocal repertoire of the 20th century and a leading work of its decade. Nixon in China was premiered in 1987. Now, keep in mind that the real world Nixon China summit happened in 1972. So at the time the opera was written, it was only 15 years old, and that's an important point to keep in mind as we go forward. I think the primary thing that makes Nixon in China so original and so important is its treatment of its source material. The real world events of Nixon's visit to the PRC in 1972. John Adams, his co-creator and the stage director Peter Sellers, and the librettist Alice Goodman, a poet who wrote the actual words of the opera, have dealt in an event that is a historical event, but again, it's only 15 years past when the opera is premiered, so it's somewhere between a historical event and a current event. The important thing about the way they treat the material is that they understand this event as essentially a modern myth, and they're exploring the mythological and psychological dimensions of this trip. So rather than just talking about how cool this opera is, how original it is, and how effective it is, let's take a look at a concrete example. The piece that I'm performing, the excerpt that I'm performing for this final project, is the Act 1 aria of the character Richard Nixon. So President Nixon is written for a baritone or bass baritone, and in Act 1, after Air Force One touches down on the tarmac at the airport in Beijing, or as it's called in the opera, Peking, Nixon shakes hands with the Premier Chou En-lai. This mirrors the real-world event. And then he begins singing an aria which does not correspond to anything that the real-world Nixon said there on the tarmac. What we hear instead is the inner monologue of a abstracted, mythologized, archetypal Richard Nixon, who is reflecting on basically the excitement of making history and what it means to make news. So in this excerpt, I want to draw your attention to a few aspects. First of all, pay attention to Alice Goodman's fantastic libretto. The words, which I'll put there for you to read, are obviously running up and down the levels from quite concrete to very, very poetic. And she's seeking out the resonances of the of this event in kind of the American psyche. And so a lot of images, prototypical American images, like the dishes being washed and homework done and the families gathered around the television. All these familiar images of Americana are mixed in there with Nixon's thoughts about the landscape in China, the historical moment and mission, and bringing peace for all mankind, as he says. The other thing that I want you to really pay attention to is how well suited John Adams' musical language is for this story. His major harmonies, his tonal conception, his driven kind of rock and roll infused pulse of this piece is kind of the perfect summation for a 1970s American president. And the whole mood of the piece is so effectively rendered by John Adams' writing. I can't imagine any other composer being able to successfully set this text or engage this subject. Now, as far as the challenges to a performer of performing this piece, I would say there are three big ones. The first one is the rhythm. The meter is constantly changing and you have to count like crazy. The second one is the memorization of the repeats. You'll notice there's many phrases that repeat numerous times but never exactly twice the same. So you have to memorize these irregular patterns of repetitions. I won't be performing from memory in this performance, but I have performed the piece from memory before. And the third one is the challenge of the range. It's actually, because I think he's rendering Nixon as very excited, it's a very high aria for a baritone, or as the singer who created it, actually a bass baritone, James Maddalena. So I will try to incorporate some visuals that point out some of the interesting parts of this piece. Pay attention to the lyrics, which, as I said, are a key part of what makes this piece so great, and enjoy this performance of the first 5 minutes or so of News Has a Kind of Mystery from Nixon in China. News, 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 news has a kind of mystery. Has a kind of mystery. When I shook hands with Cho and Lai, when I shook hands with Cho and Lai, on this bare field outside Peking, just now the whole world was listening. The whole world was listening, listening, listening. And though we spoke quietly, and though we spoke quietly, and though we spoke quietly, the eyes and ears of history, history, history caught every gesture, caught every gesture, caught every gesture and every word, transforming us as we transfixed, transforming us as we transfixed, transforming us as we transfixed, made history, history, as we made history. The eyes and ears of history, as we made history. On our flight over from Shanghai, the countryside looked drab and grey. Bruegel, Pat said, we came in peace for all mankind. I said, we came in peace for all mankind, and I was put in mind of our Apollo astronauts, simply achieving a great human dream. We live in an unsettled time. We live in an unsettled time. Who are our enemies? Who are our friends? Who are our friends? The Eastern Hemisphere beckoned to us, and we have flown east of the sun, west of the moon, across an ocean of distrust, filled with the bodies of our lost, the earth's sea of tranquility, the earth's sea of tranquility, tranquility, the earth's sea. News, 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 news. It's prime time in the USA. It's prime time in the USA. It's yesterday night. It's yesterday night. Yesterday night. They watch us now. The three main networks' colors glow, livid through drapes onto the lawn. Dishes are washed and homework done. The dog and grandma fall asleep. A car roars past, playing loud pop. Is gone. As I look down the road, I know America is good at heart. An old cold warrior piloting towards an unknown shore through shoals